Between 1939 and 1945, during World War II, approximately 6 million Jews were systematically killed in the orders of the Nazis across German-occupied Europe. These murders primarily occurred in extermination camps where prisoners endured unimaginable torture. Beatings, humiliation, solitary confinement, hanging, and flogging were common forms of punishment. Executions took place through mass shootings, hangings, and tragically gassing. The events that unfolded in these camps are indeed unimaginable and devastating. However, when considering the 17 million people murdered by the Nazi regime, we must ask, how many of these deaths can be attributed directly to Hitler? It's a complex question because, surprisingly, Hitler himself did not directly kill anyone during World War II, yet he bears ultimate responsibility for all the deaths in the Holocaust. However, he was not alone in this tragedy. Every Nazi soldier, every SS member, and every SA member played a role that contributed to the deaths of 17 million innocent people. It's unsettling to think about because these individuals were once ordinary people leading seemingly normal lives with their families. How did one malevolent individual manipulate an entire nation to commit such atrocities? Did the Nazis share culpability, or were they merely following orders? In 1941, psychologist Erich Fromm published a book titled Fear of Freedom that delves into the character structure of the modern man. In his work, Fromm proposes freedom itself evokes fear and anxiety, leading people to seek ways to escape freedom by developing an authoritarian personality. Essentially, those of this personality type treat inferiors with strict and oppressive behaviour while showing unquestioning obedience and respect to their superiors. Fromm's ideas are significantly influential in social psychology, but there are limitations in his work. For example, his conclusions are overly broad and lack sufficient evidence, and this lack of scientific rigour poses a big implication in the validity of his work. In the late 1940s, researchers led by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer expanded and refined Fromm's ideas. Adorno's theory, rooted in psychodynamic principles and influenced by Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic analogies, suggests that harsh and punitive parenting during childhood plays a crucial role in developing authoritarian tendencies. As children, individuals may suppress anger or frustration towards their parents, which are later unconsciously displaced onto those they perceive as inferior. Simultaneously, they experience fear and submission towards their parents, leading to unconscious respect and obedience toward authority figures in adulthood. With this in mind, it makes a lot of sense why 20th century Germans obtained an authoritarian personality, especially since common child-rearing practices include emphasizing discipline and obedience. Children were expected to respect authority figures, and corporal punishment was widely accepted for not doing so. In 1950, Adorno published his work titled The Authoritarian Personality. The most notorious part of this book is Adorno's California F Scale, also known as the Fascist Scale. This scale aims to assess authoritarian traits and attitudes by presenting respondents with a series of 30 statements. Participants were asked to express their level of agreement or disagreement using a precise rating scale. Those who scored highly are said to exhibit an authoritarian personality. Here are a few examples of the statements participants would be asked. In Adorno's study, he found strong positive correlations between respondents' scores on the F scale and their scores on other measures intended to assess anti-Semitism and ethnocentrism. Although sparking some controversy in 1955 involving some ethical concerns and questioning the reliability of the study, the F scale played a crucial role in demonstrating the existence of the authoritarian personality. For the next coming years, it was generally accepted that the Germans had this personality trait that made them susceptible for following orders. In 1961, Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina by Israeli agents and brought to trial in Israel. Eichmann was found guilty on 15 charges, including crimes against humanity and crimes against the Jewish people, and on 15th of December 1961, Eichmann was sentenced to death by hanging. In one final plea to save his life, Eichmann wrote a letter to the Israeli president. However, this plea was denied and he was hanged on May 31st, 1962. In his letter, he stated, "There is a need to draw the line between the leaders responsible and the people like me, forced to serve as mere instruments in the hands of the leaders. I was not a responsible leader, and as such, do not feel myself guilty." If you find this unsettling, you aren't alone. As said before, it was generally believed that the Nazis had themselves to blame for the atrocities of the Holocaust. However, Eichmann claimed he had just been following orders. Social psychologist Stanley Milgram had been particularly interested in this case and set out to investigate if this could be true. Would an ordinary person lay aside what he knew to be right or wrong merely because he was ordered to do so? Milgram believed the opposite, that it wasn't the disposition of the Germans that enabled Nazi cruelty, but the situation of World War II and a compulsion to obey. He maintained that the behaviour was the direct result of the situation, and any of us might have behaved identically in that very same context. He devised an investigation of how obedient a selection of ordinary and likeable men would be when they were told by an authority figure to deliver electric shocks to another person. The experiment took place at Yale University in 1961, where Milgram was a professor. The participants were recruited for a newspaper advertisement, and a total of 40 men were selected. They were each paid $4.50 for their participation, or £35.30 today. In the lab, Milgram had created a fake electric shock generator that had 30 switches marked in 15-volt increments with labels that indicated the intensity of different ranges of shock levels, from slight shock at 0 volts to extreme intensity shock, danger severe shock, and finally XXX at 450 volts. The role of the experimenter, or scientist, was played by a biology teacher who introduced himself to the participants as John Williams. Williams was dressed in a grey lab coat in order to give impression of authority. Participants were then told the study intended to investigate the effects of punishment on learning, and one of two volunteers would be learner and the other a teacher. In actuality, one of the two volunteers was a likeable Confederate, Mr. Wallace, who had been trained to play the role of the victim. When Mr. Wallace and the genuine participant drew paper from a hat to determine which role they would play, the draw was always fixed so that Mr. Wallace took on the role of the learner in every instance. Mr. Wallace was strapped into an electric chair with an electrode attached to his wrist. The participant was told this electrode was attached to the shock generator located in the adjacent room. To make the study appear more authentic, the teacher was given a sample shock of 45 volts. The participant was then moved to the room containing the shock generator and asked to read a series of word pairs such as butter, milk, or nice day, allowed for the learner to memorise. After this, the teacher was to read out a series of single words. The learner's task was to recall the pairing word in each case and indicate his answer. If the learner's answer was correct, the questions continued. However, if the answer was incorrect, the participant was instructed to read out the correct answer and announce the level of shock he was about to receive before administering the shock. For every wrong answer, the participant would increase the level of shocks by 15 volts. As part of the experiment, Mr. Wallace had been briefed to answer incorrectly around one question in every 4 to ensure the participant would be required to start applying electric shocks. During the experiments, once the voltage had reached 300 volts, Mr. Wallace would start shouting more frantically as the shock level increased and then eventually cease making any noise at all. The participant was told to treat any unanswered question as an incorrectly answered question and apply the next level of shock voltage. By this point, Milgram expected participants to express their misgivings about continuing the experiment. In order to prevent this, the scientist had 4 verbal prods to encourage him. These ranged from a simple request to continue being told they had no choice but to continue. If he refused to obey, the experiment was terminated. Milgram found 100% of participants applied shocks up to 300 volts, the point at which the learner began to shout in pain. 65% applied shocks to the maximum of 450 volts, indicating ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. To explain why this occurs, Milgram has identified 2 concepts: legitimacy of authority and the agentic shift. A legitimate authority is someone perceived to be in a position of social control within a situation. We learn at a young age to obey those who have authority over us because we trust them and/or because they have the ability to punish us. And a good example of this is Bickman's 1974 obedience study. In his study, the experimenter assumed different roles: a guard, a milkman, or a civilian. The experimenter asked a pedestrian to pick up a paper bag on the floor and, if necessary, explained it was because of a bad back. If the participant followed the order, it meant they obeyed the authority. Bickman found 82% obeyed dressed as a guard, 64% dressed as a milkman, and 36% dressed as a civilian. These findings are very consistent with Milgram's variations of his study. This time, John Williams acted as a participant in the study, dressed in ordinary clothes. The percentage of participants administering 450 volts decreased from 65% to 20%. Similarly, when the study was conducted in a run-down office block rather than Yale University where it was originally conducted, obedience dropped again from 65% to 47.5%, highlighting the power of legitimacy of authority. Another concept Milgram identified is the idea of the agentic shift. Milgram argued people operate in one of 2 ways when faced with social situations. First, people act autonomously, meaning they make their own decisions upon their own sets of morals. However, when they identify with a legitimate authority figure, they can enter the agentic state where they carry out orders upon an authority's sets of morals, diminishing themselves of personal responsibility. In Milgram's experiment, the 65% who administered the full 450 volts were arguably in the agentic state. However, in one of Milgram's variations, an additional confederate administered the shock on behalf of the teacher. In this variation, the percentage of participants that administered the full 450 volts rose devastatingly from 65% to 92.5%. This highlights the power of shifting responsibility, as these participants were able to shift their responsibility onto the person administering the electric shocks and continue obeying orders because they felt less responsible. In psychology, when explaining human behaviour, it's crucial to consider all possible explanations for a comprehensive analysis. In this case, we explore both dispositional and situational factors to explain obedience. Dispositional factors emphasize the role of internal factors in shaping behaviour, such as emotions and personality traits, for example, the authoritarian personality. Situational factors emphasizes the role of external factors in shaping behaviours, such as social norms and situational pressures, for example, the presence of an authoritative figure. These contrasting perspectives are fundamental in psychology, and most people either agree with one or the other. So how do we know which explanation is correct, the dispositional or situational? To answer this, Milgram collaborated with Arthur Elms in 1966. They investigated whether obedient participants in Milgram's research displayed authoritarian personality traits compared to disobedient participants. In a replication of Milgram's initial study, they examined 20 obedient participants who administered the full 450 volts and 20 disobedient participants who refused to continue. During the experiment, participants answered open-ended questions about their relationships with parents, the experimenter, and the learner. Months later, they completed personality tests, including the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI for short, and of course the famous California F Scale. Obedient and defiant participants showed little differentiation on the MMPI. However, obedient participants scored higher on the F scale in comparison to disobedient participants. Additionally, obedient participants were less close to their fathers during childhood and admired the experimenter in Milgram's experiment, which was the opposite for disobedient participants. Elms and Milgram concluded that obedient participants exhibited higher levels of the authoritarian personality, therefore proving both situational and dispositional explanations intersect when explaining obedience. Not everyone consistently obeys authority. Milgram's findings were never absolute, only 65 surpassed 300 volts, indicating that humans sometimes have the tendency to disobey. Additionally, there are multiple other explanations for obedience, such as CCTV, bias, and coercive power. On an important note, just because you obey, it does not necessarily mean you have an authoritarian personality. The question whether or not Eichmann really deserved his punishment is controversial, but Milgram puts it perfectly. Obedience to authority is not a feature of German culture, but a seemingly universal feature of human behaviour. We learn obedience from a young age and have evolved to follow authority figures. It's ingrained in our nature. While the Nazis were undeniably responsible for the devastation of World War II, destructive obedience extends beyond the Holocaust. The My Lai massacre and Yugoslavia genocides are other cases in which soldiers claim they were just following orders. It is easier to believe that there are fundamental differences between the Nazis and the rest of humanity than to accept in certain situations many of us are capable of committing extraordinary acts of violence.